I would love to speak to you guys about some of the challenges that you have as operators in terms of operating for today's environment, but still realizing that there is growth, both near term in terms of volume with BDSA showing over 3% growth, and as well as on a long-term basis. So what are some of the challenges and unique perspectives that has for you guys as operators? Aaron, if you want to kick things off there?
I mean, I would say, first and foremost, challenges is when do you invest in your states ahead of growth, right? I mean, when you talk about pricing pressure, you look at a state like Illinois that's going to issue, 185 dispensaries, and the timing of those coming online impacts the amount of supply that you have into the market. So I think oversupply has definitely been a challenge that we've had to work through as an industry. And for an operator like us, we very much have diversified our portfolio so we can play at the different pricing levels. But the challenges are still there. And I mean, in cannabis as a whole, you're looking at the COVID impact, recessionary pressure, where things cost more money, but we're in an environment where prices are coming down, and you have to keep the doors open and continue to run your business. So I would say from that perspective, it's been a little bit of a challenge, but those growth drivers haven't shifted out. Those dispensaries are still slated to open at some point, so it's just when do you position yourself ahead of that growth?
Great. Camilo, anything to add from Peerless?
Yeah. Dovetailing what Aaron said, I think it's a very simplistic picture. We as an industry have a very strong demand pattern that we're seeing as new consumers come into the category. That's fantastic. So really this is a supply issue. As Aaron mentioned, that supply has caused pricing to come down in pretty much many of the markets that we all operate in to varying degrees. That supply through natural economic forces is taken out of the market, and that's a good thing for pricing. We're seeing green shoots in different states like in Massachusetts, and others in Pennsylvania, for instance, that are showing more of a bottoming out on pricing and in particular categories, an uptrend on pricing. So I really believe that this is more of a cyclical issue from a supply side being overextended. That is now being taken out of the market. So from a challenging perspective, on an economic front, that's working its way through the process. Regulatory will always be a challenge until there's some movement on the federal legislative front. And like Aaron said, Aaron Miles, we have the benefit of being diversified across multiple states that can offset varying degrees of pricing compression and pressures on the consumer, so that we have a more balanced portfolio approach to leverage the growth that this industry will continue to exhibit.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a more unique perspective on this than most people. As we see price compression is a positive in my mind. As all of us scale up, we all drive down costs, drive up efficiencies. And so as we see prices go lower, Aaron mentioned it, we've seen 30% increase in unit sales. That's unit sales that we've taken from the illicit market. A lot of that is. And so this is going to be a continued trend where we get more people into the regulated market. Pricing will stabilize, supply will stabilize, and then you'll get back to a more normalized pricing environment. So I think that's a super big positive that a lot of people don't talk about, but from my perspective is a big plus from a consumer safety and getting people into a regulated market.
And Andrew, I'd love your take, because I know you guys sell being low cost. You're also in California, which is a new perspective you can provide. So, what's your perspective from being low cost and seeing some of the more pricing pressured states such as California, and how you look to address it?
Yeah, I mean, we had a thesis getting into this industry that you need to be a low cost producer. And if you're not a low cost producer, price compression is just a fact of life in cannabis. And if you're not a low cost producer, I don't think you have a chance of survival, to be honest. So, we have high single-digit market share. Our facilities in Washington State, which is a super competitive market where we're able to drive really healthy margins, good cash flow. So we have a lot of confidence that, we have the capabilities to, compete against anyone, given our success in Washington. So, I think you have to be a low-cost producer. I think that you have to replicate that in every single state you're in. And I think we're in this shakeout period. And I think further, when you talk about California and New York, those states' willingness to tolerate lawlessness has been a real impediment to the growth of those industries. I mean, New York City's got, 1,400 illicit dispensaries? It's a joke. If I opened a illicit liquor store, they'd hopefully shut me down in 10 minutes. But New York, California, haven't been willing to do that. So, they're working, you heard the last speaker, they're working through that process, but I think it's going to be slow. And there's going to be longer shakeout periods in those two states. But, the bottom line is I think you need to be a low-cost producer to be competitive.
Great, thanks for that. And Tom, I'm sure a lot of your clients are dealing with similar issues to yours. So from your perspective, how are your clients and how do you see it from your perspective in terms of dealing with this current dynamic of the industry in terms of long-term growth, but some near-term pressures?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about the cannabis industry is obviously there are a lot of challenges that are unique to the industry, and some of them are quite substantial, but those are also the opportunities. And I think the trick here obviously is to navigate a current regulatory context that in 5 years is probably going to look very, very different, including perhaps on a federal level. So then the question becomes, okay, you're mentioning California, New York, and it is really, I'm from California, and we do a lot of our second largest offices in New York, very familiar with both markets. And New York is looking a lot like California, and in some sense that's depressing. I think as a company, as an MSO, it makes sense, and I know that the companies here look at this, to look at new markets strategically. I don't think it's necessary to own assets in every market. So while in the short term, owning assets in this market or that market makes a lot of sense, once prohibition ends, is it going to make sense necessarily to have assets in every single state that emerges? Sometimes it's best to take a look at a state, perhaps like California, perhaps like New York, and maybe you want to license into 1 or 2 states as opposed to actually having heavy assets there. So I think really it's trying to figure out how to navigate the current regulatory landscape while giving a nod to the fact that things are going to look very different very suddenly. Prohibition ends and certain other things happen.
Great, thanks for that. And one of the things you guys touched on a lot was pricing pressure, something that we all acknowledge that we have to deal with. It's a constant topic of discussion among operators, investors, really all stakeholders. So how do you look at where we are currently in terms of pricing, continued pricing pressure, today versus where we were a year ago, and how you see the back half of the year? And I know it's very state by state, so when they want to touch on it more broadly or maybe more specific states, I think that'd be helpful. So Camilo, I know you're in a bunch of states with Curaleaf, so that'd be helpful from your perspective.
Sure. We've actually seen really good pricing trends in our business relative to what publicly available information would state. We see price increases in Illinois. We see price increases in Massachusetts. We see price increases in Pennsylvania, whereas the market is actually suffering from price compression in this market. So we owe that to our focus on leveraging our retail business. Our retail business last year was $1 billion by itself. And I think a common trend that you'll be hearing about, if you haven't already, is that a lot of these larger MSOs, I think my colleague to my left and to my right, are also doing it, focusing more on driving their own branded sales. So, from our perspective, the way to best manage against price compression is to drive the proliferation of your own branded strategy, and that comes with having a robust portfolio that can be best served to consumers that are looking for good, better, best across all form factors. So we've invested a lot in our R&D efforts to achieve that. The flip side to that is also making sure that we run a very efficient process on our cost of goods and making sure that our facilities are really driving maximum efficiency through the channel, so that we can avert any sort of external price compression that may be around us.
I would add that it's obviously state by state. You're seeing great pricing trends actually out west, where you saw a trough last year. We've seen a double and tripling of flower prices in California. But just to tag on to Camilo's point, one of the things we don't talk about in low-cost production is quality starting to matter. This consumer's getting smarter. And if you look at a state like Massachusetts, pricing really started to drop last year. And people sort of said, I've got to move a lot of weight, so maybe I'll just drop it to $1,100 a pound. And I guess my point here is that there almost isn't a clearing price for bad product. So you're really having to differentiate yourself not only through your brands, but through the quality of your product. And 50% of the market is still flower. So we've spent a lot of time making sure that our flower quality is top notch and improving. Because if you don't have good product in the market's starting to suss that out. And that's just the fact of life also in a maturing cannabis market.
Yeah, it's a nice segue into the next question I want to touch on in terms of consumer preferences, right? So one of the bigger questions they had, especially kind of going into COVID, is whether or not this is going to be a staple or discretionary product. I think it's proven out to be more on the staple side, but we'd love to get your take into what you're seeing at the consumer level, how you see it as a staple versus discretionary product, and what you're seeing in terms of the average ticket, or what consumer preferences you've seen change over the past 2 to 3 years. So, Aaron, love to kick that off.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, we're getting more data to absorb, right? So as we're maturing as an industry and we're expanding our footprint, opening up more retail, you're talking to more budtenders, you're getting a better idea of how you need to evolve and adapt your portfolio. So for us, we really focused on premium product early on, and now we're starting to branch out into our Savvy and our Essence line, which are value and our mid-tier, which really can hit consumer taste across the board. You're also adapting and really building out your edible suite and looking into new form factors as well. And this is based on data that we're actually getting as a company, and it's really starting to resonate. A significant portion of our sales are coming from new product launches, and it's based off of feedback that we're getting. And to kind of touch on what Andrew was talking about too, from a pricing perspective, when you evolve your portfolio and you're operating at the premium price point to start, and then you start to see pricing compression and pricing pressure, it's really hard because you don't want to cannibalize your premium products. So for us to be able to evolve and adapt our portfolio has allowed us to play around with different pricing at different levels, which then allows us to really adapt and kind of securing a very strong margin profile. But overall, it's really just consuming data and evolving your portfolio ahead of that demand.
Yeah, I think Aaron makes a good point there. He just opened up his 129th store today, and I guarantee you if you walk from here down to Wall Street, you're going to run into more Walgreens, CVS's, than those stores. And so as we continue to evolve and scale our business, being able to collect the data from our retail footprint, we have 37 operational stores. And so for us, we led with retail and are now backing into that upstream process, just finishing cultivation, processing facilities in Pennsylvania and Virginia, kind of our two key core markets, being able to produce those products that sell through our retail store is super important to understand. For Jushi, we did it a little bit different. We started with the good and better. We're now flipping back into the best, and that focus is going to be around flower and pre-rolls, because when you talk about product mix, you're still seeing 50 to 60% of your sales through stores being flower-based products. And so I think it's super interesting how the consumer, which was just shopping price and THC, has now started to look at terpenes, bud structure, so on and so forth. And so that evolution of the customer is coming fast and furious to all states, quite frankly, not just to California and Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. So that's been really exciting to see somebody coming from the West Coast moving east. It's super interesting to see how fast that's happened.
Aaron, to go back to the question a little bit though, is this a discretionary item or a staple? I think the most exciting thing about cannabis is that it's actually both, at least from where I sit. It is something that is medicine. It is something that serves as an alternative to alcohol for escapism purposes. So this is truly a category in its nascency from an industry growth perspective that is hitting so many different age demographics for so many different use cases. Clearly, we're seeing the staple-like quality of it as traffic in our stores continues to be very robust. We had 24% organic traffic growth last year, which is a very strong indicator that the category and we are gaining interest and gaining share from other categories like alcohol. It's very clear when you look at the beer data and the alcohol data that those sales are on the decline. Meanwhile, cannabis sales are on the increase. So that's what's exciting about the category. Now the next level of analysis comes into how do you bring in more customers, how do you have a product suite that really speaks to all different sorts of consumers' use cases. And I think that's the stage of the evolution of the industry that we're in right now, creating something that really hits home for all of our customers, whether it be more of like the heavy flower smoker, or someone who comes in who's interested in learning more about cannabis that really wants a glass of wine and an edible, as my wife likes to refer to it. So it's really the gamut of opportunity sets that to us is exciting, that continues to exhibit those very similar profiles, both discretionary as well as stable.
To amplify what Camilla is talking about, it's interesting watching my parents and others like that start to wade into the cannabis territory. And they don't smoke a joint, right? It's typically about an edible or it's about a beverage or something like that. And so it's exciting because when you're looking at the market today, there's still that legacy of cannabis is something you smoke. And I think over the next decade, we're going to see a shifting away from that. And I find that to be personally exciting toward edibles, toward beverages, and toward those sorts of things. Not in the next year, but during the next decade. Also, I think it's going to be interesting watching a shift back to a medical focus, right? There's been a lot of excitement moving from medicinal to recreational, but I do think that some of the value of the marketplace is going to look backwards toward medical as we learn that, I think as someone, I think Miller might have said it, this really is a medical conversation as well. And that conversation per capita is actually larger than a recreational conversation, because if you're dealing with the pain of cancer, what does cannabis mean to your life as opposed to smoking a joint to get high and relax a little bit after work? That's important too, but the former is just so much more valuable per capita. And as we discover that really this is medicine, in addition to being something that lets you unwind after work, we're going to see a reshifting of focus back to some extent toward medical.
And I would say this too, I mean, and we're doing this all with limited marketing and advertising capabilities. So you're trying to grow your product footprint and you're trying to adapt your product portfolio, and state by state it's different. Go to California, people are smelling terpenes and being like, I like this indica, more than this one. And you go into a state like Illinois and people are like, what's indica and what's sativa? So how do you build a consistent portfolio across your footprint that can adapt to all your different consumer base? But advertising and marketing, and then when you're educating on the medicinal front, we're clearly getting pushback from higher powers that don't want us to really get out there and start to cannibalize their industry.
Fantastic. So we're talking about some of these consumer shifts. We talked about terpenes. We talked about derivative products. So where do you think we are in terms of educating the consumer today and where the consumer is going to shift to? Because a lot of people still say, THC. That's where the consumer is today. We're talking a little bit now where the consumer is heading towards and where it's going. So how do you think that's going to shift, both in terms of flower and also to derivative formats? And what do you think are some things that need to be done on the innovative front, either genetics on the flower or in terms of new derivative products via edibles, oils, or otherwise? And how do you think that's going to shift for the next year or two?
I think we're just scratching the surface. Literally just scratching the surface. The cannabis plant has over 100 cannabinoids. We know mainly 2 of them. Generally, the public knows THC and CBD. A lot of this has become the lack of research at the federal level, because of the federal overlays, is part and parcel why we don't know more about the plant. And the more that we do, and we have an R&D team dedicated to not only exploring more different form factors, but also different cannabinoids, the more excited I get about the applications that I guarantee many people don't even know about. Whether it's THCV and its appetite suppressant qualities that are non-psychoactive, and how that could help out in terms of the nutraceutical, weight management market, or diabetic market. There's so much more to learn about this plant. And I think we're just literally scratching the surface.
We're seeing it, across our portfolio, and I'm seeing it anecdotally every day. The original vape pen that came to market was a simple distillate vape pen, and that you'd add, natural terpenes to flavor it. And, here you are 5 years, after we've been in Massachusetts, you have customers saying, okay, I want fresh frozen, I want live rosin, I want, all these different types. So I think that, it's just going to be a natural maturing and education of that consumer. And I've always said that, with alcohol, we have such a societal bias of trial and error. I know that I don't like scotch. I know that I like IPAs. I know that I'm going to have a Coors Light if I play golf. All of that societally instilled trial and error that happens with alcohol is currently happening with cannabis. And I think as that process happens, people will really start to dial in on, what works for them. And it's not going to be just highest THC you can get. It's going to be, people are going to pay more attention to the terpene profile and what effect, they like, either from a recreational or medicinal standpoint.
And Tom, from your perspective, I know you have clients in New York, California, some of the states where they're looking to build brands the most. I think you also do some work with FDA regulations as well. So how do you think that ultimately plays into how these consumer prices trend over time and what you're seeing from your clients?
It was the last acronym, the FDA?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Aaron, first of all, I think one thing to note is that education is going to be held back so long as the illicit market continues to thrive, right? Because I think the biggest point to be made in education is that illicit products are often very, very dangerous. What educational message is more important than that one, right? And that folks should be very, but if you walk down the streets of New York, you have to ask if they're a licensed shop. You can't tell just by walking by the shop, particularly if you're an unsophisticated consumer that's just wading into cannabis for the first time. So I think that that's the first thing that needs to be addressed is the illicit market, particularly in California, New York. Until we conquer that problem, or at least make it a serious dent, I think education is going to have a problem keeping up with the growing consumer base. Another point on the FDA front, I think that is a material part of things. That once the FDA, once federal prohibition ends, and you have the FDA saying that this stuff is healthy, and we can get into a serious conversation about the benefits of this plant and prospective risk, which I think are very small relative to the benefits, we can start to have a real conversation about education. So the FDA does have a role to play, and it's really sad and frustrating that Biden didn't do what he said he was going to do, which was to do something on the legalization front at the federal level. So that's a great disappointment. I think a great hindrance to education across the board.
There's still time.
And one point to add on here too is the adjacent industry and the way that you can adapt your portfolio for getting into new product and form factors. I mean, beverages. I mean, Camilo mentioned it from a whole a holistic view, but we are scratching the surface in multiple areas. And you look, alcohol sales are coming down. You read reports that foot traffic in bars are going up, but sales are coming down, and people are walking in now with a vape pen and not having 12 beers or having 2. And if we can, as a collective industry, come up with product alternatives where your Coors Light on the golf course is now infused with cannabis, and the nano emulsification kicks in, and it's going to be very similar experience to drinking a beer. There's a real opportunity there. But again, it's we're operating. We talk about 13 active states. We are running 13 separate businesses. We can't have economies of scale. We can't have a huge beverage distribution center. So we're limited, and I think it's definitely by design to keep other industries thriving.
Yeah, I think all of that's very true, because if you walk into a bar, they have a monopoly in a bar. Alcohol does. Not anymore. Biggest growth factor in drinks is non-alc. And so I think you're starting to see people gravitate away towards alcohol, and they want some sort of lift or buzz. Cannabis is going to be that once we're able to do so. But in the meantime, people still like to get high. They still like to smoke flower. And so I think the super important piece is also around the genetics of the plant. If you're able to bring some certain strain to market and be able to produce that for whether it's patients or consumers, that's still a winning play in the space. And so, you've seen the craft beer industry grow versus the Bud Lights and the Coors Lights. And so there's a market for that as well. And so I think everybody's trying to chase this new innovative product, but at the same time, don't forget that flower, vapes, still make up, 75% of sales in the marketplace. You just need to have some innovation within that, being genetics or fresh frozen, live resin, live rosin, so on and so forth. So, still a lot to be played with from that standpoint of ratios and so on and so forth. So, we're only in the second inning of a very long baseball game.
No, absolutely. So I want to talk about capital allocation real quickly. Given the dynamics of the market, how do you think about, number one, CapEx, being strategic about it because capital is limited in the market, and then number two, potential M&A. You guys are some of the largest operators in the United States. So how do those two dynamics play out given the current dynamic of the marketplace? Camille, you want to start off with Curly?
Sure. We have the fortune of being largely built out in the U.S. Like I said earlier, we're in 19 states. We have our operations in everywhere we want to be. And so our CapEx, our investments in these states is largely behind us. So our CapEx is naturally coming down as a result of that. We're going to be 50% below what it was last year. The flip side is we're also investing in our European operations. And we think that that's a really strong differentiating point for Curaleaf relative to our other partners in the space, So we're the only MSO that has that international presence. So that's something that we're very excited about. See a tremendous opportunity in the German and the UK market to really invest behind this global cannabis movement that we see unfolding over the next 5 to 10 years.
And Tom, I'd love to get your perspective in terms of the M&A side. Because a lot of things that I hear about is debts, debt maturities, implications for there. So what that could mean from bankruptcies, given the federal illegality of cannabis, and then number two, AR balances that you're hearing about in California. So from your perspective, from a law firm, what makes it different in terms of what you have from a regular operations in the industry that's unique to cannabis in terms of dealing with those things, debt maturities and AR balances, given the legality of it?
Sure. Well, I think that's such a large question, just to pare it down, because you can talk about so many different elements of things. The first thing, I think, is that sometimes basic fundamentals aren't followed as much in cannabis as you see in other industries. So as an example, let's take California. You have half of the dispensaries, more than half, that aren't paying their consumers, but there is still a focus by some major companies on acquiring as many dispensaries as possible. And it's really like chasing losses. Yes, you're growing your revenues, but you're growing your losses at the same time. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The cannabis companies, there's an interesting statistic, which I'm sure many of us have seen, that cannabis companies collectively owe over $250 million to the state of California in back taxes. That is an amazing statistic, because taxes are what you don't pay last. So it tells you how stressed this industry is and how serious the AR problem is becoming, with companies not getting paid for inventory that's already been sold. When you're looking at remedies, it's really restricted, obviously, because you can't show up in bankruptcy court, federal court, with federally prohibited substance as the subject matter of your business and ask for relief. But at the same time, it also is quite interesting to see such a lack of focus on alternative remedies. So for instance, you can do receiverships in bankruptcy. You can do that as a state remedy. And it varies by state, but they absolutely are viable alternatives to bankruptcy. There's also an assignment for the benefit of creditors, an ABC. And those are real remedies. Receivership tends to be more involuntary, and my firm has done that. And it's very expensive, typically preceded by litigation, because you're typically having a creditor wanting to force a debtor into some sort of receivership, and the debtor typically resists it. The target company typically resists. So that gets litigated. You force a receiver in there, but once that happens, you can do some very interesting things. And an assignment for benefit of creditors typically tends to be much cheaper. It tends to be voluntary, but you're really winding down a company as opposed to trying to continue operations. There are other alternatives, and these alternatives can make a lot of sense. I also think even south of going to a receivership model or to an ABC model, the notion of restructuring, I think, could be powerful here, right? Because so many companies really are burdened by poor decisions that were made early on in the process, and there's an illicit history to this industry that informs a lot of the contracts that were entered into early on. Having a restructuring take place, I think, gives you a platform. It gives you a leverage point to renegotiate many of those deals, and also I think to take a brand new look at your company in a way that I think has gravitas, that has weight, where you can really make some changes that make a lot of sense. So it's quite surprising that some of these remedies that are looked to so often outside of cannabis are not looked to inside of cannabis for a poor reason, which is federal illegality, which does not preclude receivership options and ABC options and restructuring options.
That's great. So we got about 2 minutes left, so I do want to ask a final question here and get something from both of you guys. So talk about the federal level. That's really one of the biggest things in cannabis is what changes are we going to see? SAFE has been reintroduced. It's got its first ever Senate hearing. We're also looking for potential rescheduling. So we want to think about how you think about potential changes at the federal level, which may either SAFE or rescheduling. What changes do you think it might have on the business and the industry? So Andrew, we're going to kick it up with you and then work our way down.
Well, I'll say that we are operating our business as though nothing's going to happen federally. And I think that's just, the going assumption right now. And people are saying, all right, we got to make sure our business is cash flowing, and we've got to be focusing on, the highest value add pieces of our business. Camilo, as far as what's going on at the federal level, you probably have as good an insight as any.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think everyone has to manage their business as if nothing is going to happen. That said, I do believe we can take it individually, but on the SAFE side, there's two big factors that I think are very different this time around than in previous years. Number one, the process was started in May. This gives us the rest of the calendar year, as opposed to what we've seen in prior years, last year in particular, where there was an attempt by the Senate and Schumer and company to get something through at the very end on a Christmas package that had no shot of ever getting through. So the fact that it's now being taken on as a standalone bill, going through the proper order, getting its due time in the public, in the forum, through the markup period, through the debate period, I think bodes very well. The fact that the Senate heard anything on cannabis for the first time is very positive as well. So I think from a timeline perspective, on an optimistic time frame, we're hopeful that we can get passage of SAFE through the Senate by the summer, August recess. If that happens, then it'll get over to the House, and we can make a push as an industry to lobby all the members of the House, it's already passed it several times, to get on board and get it through. So on the optimistic time frame, we could see something by year end or early Q1. On the federal level, on the rescheduling front, my view has always been that it was a two-stage process. One, federal review done by the agencies of the veracity of the scheduling of cannabis. And that usually takes about a 6 to 9 month process. We're in that window right now. So, I think it's very clear that cannabis has medical purposes. So that immediately should disqualify it from being on Schedule 1. So I think the review process is underway. It's likely headed to some sort of conclusion. It'll go from the FDA to the HHS. They will then issue their recommendation based on what the FDA has said. Our view is that Becerra out of California, who runs HHS, is pro-cannabis, so that should be also favorable. Then it will land in the lap of the DEA. And so what the DEA does is what's probably most interesting, because that will be the final point of recommendation to the descheduling. I think that from what I know, that the DEA is probably most concerned about violating any treaties with the UN. So that probably needs to be reconciled. Although I will say that Canada has and remains in violation of the UN treaty with cannabis. So there's precedent there. All of this is to say that on the federal rescheduling effort, I think unfortunately it'll come down to a politically motivated action that will come to some sort of head next year in front of the elections, likely being taken on as a point of differentiation by Biden to capture the youth folks and show that he's actually been progressive on his claims and his promises when he first ran 4 years ago.
All right, great. Well, I think that's a great place to end things. Thanks for that, Camilo. Thanks for everyone for joining me. Andrew, Trent, Tom, Camilo, Aaron, thanks for joining me here today. Hope you guys found it value-added and helpful, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.